My favorite author, David Graeber. This is a reading from his book, The Democracy Project, which is backwards. Don't know why. Anyway, for most Americans in their early 20s, their first experience of political engagement came in the elections of 2006 and 2008, when young people turned out in roughly twice the numbers they usually did and voted overwhelmingly for Democrats. As a candidate, Barack Obama ran a campaign carefully designed to appeal to progressive youth, with spectacular results. It's hard to remember that Obama not only ran as a candidate of change, but used language that drew liberally from that of radical social movements. Yes, We Can was adapted from Cesar Chavez's United Farm Workers movement. Be the change is a phrase often attributed to Gandhi, and that as a former community organizer and member of the left-wing New Party, he was one of the few candidates in recent memory who could be said to have emerged from a social movement background rather than from the usual smoke-filled rooms. What's more, he organized his grassroots campaign much like a social movement. Young volunteers were encouraged not just to phone bank and to go door to door, but to create enduring organizations that would continue to work for progressive causes, support strikes, create food banks, organize local environmental campaigns long after the election. All this, combined with the fact that Obama was to be the first African-American president, gave young people a sense that they were participating in a genuinely transformative movement in American politics. No doubt most of the young people who worked for or supported the Obama campaign were uncertain just how transformative this all would be. But most were ready for genuinely profound changes in the very structure of American democracy. Remember that all this was happening in a country where there is such a straitjacket on acceptable political discourse. What a politician or media pundit can say without being written off as a member of the lunatic fringe, that the views of the very large segments of American public simply are never voiced at all. To give a sense of how radical is the disconnect between acceptable opinion and the actual feelings of American voters, consider a pair of polls conducted by Rasmussen, the first in December 2008, right after Obama was elected, and the second in April 2011. A broad sampling of Americans was asked which economic system they preferred, capitalism or socialism. In 2008, 15% felt the United States would be better off adapting a socialist system. 3 years later, the number had gone up to 1 in 5. Even more striking was the breakdown by age. The younger the respondent, the more likely they were to object to the idea of spending the rest of their lives under a capitalist system. Among Americans between 15 and 25, a plurality did still prefer capitalism, 37%, as opposed to 33% in favor of socialism. The remaining 30% remained unsure. But think about what this means here. It means that almost two-thirds of America's youth are willing to at least consider the idea of jettisoning the capitalist system entirely. In a country where most have never even seen a single politician, TV pundit, or talking head willing to reject capitalism in principle, or to use the term socialism as anything but a term of condescension and abuse, this is genuinely extraordinary. Granted, for that very reason, it's hard to know exactly what young people who say they prefer socialism actually think they're embracing. One has to assume not an economic system modeled on that of North Korea. What then? Sweden? Canada? It's impossible to say. But in a way, it's also beside the point. Most Americans might not be sure what socialism is supposed to be, but what they do know a great deal about capitalism, and if socialism means anything to them, it means the other thing, or perhaps better, something pretty much anything, really, as long as it isn't that. To get a sense of just how extreme matters have become, another poll asked Americans to choose between capitalism and communism, and 1 out of 10 Americans actually stated they would prefer a Soviet-style system to the economic system existing today. In 2008, young Americans preferred Obama to John McCain by a rate of 68% to 30%, again, an approximately two-thirds margin. It seems at the very least reasonable to assume that most young Americans who cast their votes for Obama expected a little more than what they got. They felt they were voting for a transformative figure. Many did clearly expect some kind of fundamental change in the system, even if they weren't sure what. How then might one expect such a young American voter to feel on discovering that they had in fact elected a moderate conservative? This might seem an extreme statement by the standards of mainstream political discourse, but I'm really just using the word conservative in the literal sense of the term. That literal sense is now rarely used. Nowadays, in the United States at least, conservative has mainly come to be used for right-wing radical, whereas long-standing literal meaning was someone whose main political imperative is to conserve existing institutions to protect the status quo. This is precisely what Obama has turned out to be. Almost all his greatest political efforts have been aimed at preserving some institutional structure under threat: the banking system, the auto industry, even the health insurance industry. Obama's main argument in calling for healthcare reform was that the existing system, based on for-profit private insurers, was not economically viable over the long term, and that some kind of change was going to be necessary. What was his solution? Instead of pushing a genuinely radical or even liberal restructuring of the system towards fairness and sustainability, he instead revived a Republican model first proposed in the 1990s as the conservative alternative to the Clintons' universal health plan. Details were hammered out in right-wing think tanks like the Heritage Foundation and initially put into practice by a Republican governor of Massachusetts. Its appeal was essentially conservative. It didn't solve the problem of how to create a fair and sensible health care system. It solved the problem of how to preserve the existing unfair and unsustainable for-profit system in a form that might allow it to endure for at least another generation.